Hello. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, their elders past, present and emerging. So good afternoon. My name's Laura Fraser-Hardy. I am a member of the board of Chifley Research Centre. I'm also currently employed as the Chief of Staff to the Attorney General, Minister for Justice, Minister for Women and the Minister for the Prevention of Domestic and Family Violence in Queensland. And prior to my employment with the state government, I was employed as a senior associate at Hall Payne Lawyers, where I practiced primarily in employment and industrial relations. So the panel discussion here today is on the challenges of balance in work and care in contemporary Australia. And I think there's a lot of issues to discuss. Talking about casualisation, whether it can offer flexibility, to whom and at what cost. How do we respond when unpaid care can't fill the gaps left by failings in social support and the paid care sector? How are we measuring the value of home lives and in household care? And how is that being considered when our governments and tribunals are considering what fair working hours really are? These discussions are how we can recognise the reality of the challenges of balancing work and care in Australia. These are, I think, in many ways, personal discussions. And the choices made by families are sometimes a reflection of personal values, but they're also overwhelmingly driven by external and structural factors entirely out of their control. In 2015, after the birth of my second child, I returned to work as a lawyer, with my husband actually accessing the government paid parental leave. And that was a benefit that I didn't have the benefit of with my first child. But returning to work for me was frankly the best move for our family. I earned more than my electrician husband, and to be frank, it was better for my mental health, and therefore for the health of the whole family. My husband, probably not unsurprisingly, found that taking what ended up to be 9 months of paid parental leave wasn't particularly good for his career as an electrician. But I returned to work at 14 weeks postpartum, being able to access 14 weeks of paid parental leave from my employer at the time. And I returned and I pumped breast milk several times a day. Can I make it clear, while also charging $275 an hour at the time? Sitting there typing and pumping at the same time, multitasking at its best. And hilariously and perhaps crazily, I was also at the time running in a marginal seat for the 2016 federal election. So I worked and I was a marginal seat candidate for that year. But my point being is that I made those decisions because they were what worked best for my family structure, and they worked best associated with what our income levels were and what our values were within our family and what mattered to us. So I wanted to say that the decisions made within family structures around work and care reflect firstly the structures imposed on workers, the availability of care, the way workplaces are structured and those financial implications. But secondly, those decisions are dependent entirely on the values which are shared within that family dynamic. And it's some of those issues that we will be talking about this afternoon. So this afternoon we have a group of amazing speakers who I'd like to invite in turn to make a short introduction before we move on to a broader discussion and then also to take some questions from the floor. So the first up today is Professor Lynn Craig. Lynn is a Professor of Sociology and Social Policy and an Australian Research Council Future Fellow in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. Her interests include the time impacts of children, care and social reproduction, motherhood, fatherhood and gender equity, the division of domestic labour, work-family balance and comparative family and social policy. Welcome, Lynn.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and their elders past, present and emerging. I've been looking at the issues of work and care from the family perspective for some time. I began my academic career at the turn of the century when there was quite a lot of data in Australia on time use, and I took that data and analysed it to find out why it was so difficult to be a mother in Australia. I had been part of the wave of young women who went to university, first time in our families, often in the 70s. We didn't expect to come into the workforce later and be housewives. It was something that was quite a shock. And I actually grew up in New Zealand. Then I moved to Norfolk Island and lived in an idyllic area when I had my children very small, moved to Australia. Thought I'd go back into the workforce when my children were respectively 3 and 5 and found it was almost impossible. There was childcare was hard to get, it was expensive, It was very difficult to manage with the long hours that my husband was working. He was, like Laura, a lawyer, and he was the one who was doing that work in our family. Now, that wasn't really our values, so I think that we did what we could under the circumstances, but I found it so surprising and kind of, really? Like, really? We're all educated now, we're doing this, we've got ambitions, we've got potential, we've been invested in. My education was free, that's not the case for young women today, but there was a strong social investment as well. And yet here we were at a point where it was very difficult for two individuals to work it out, to share that. And so when I went back to university to finish a qualification, because my qualifications weren't recognised in Australia, that was another problem, but that's not to do with what we're talking about today. It was my research interest to look at what it is about Australia and the way its social organisation of work and care, because I think we need to see them together. We need they're work and care are two parts of the total social organisation of labour, both of which are effortful, important, productive, underpin the economy in the case of care, perpetuate the economy obviously in the case of paid work. And what I did, which was quite new at the time, was adding up the total workload, taking account of paid and unpaid work together. And so we could see that how much of a person's labour in their day was remunerated, and obviously it was very different by gender. A lot more of men's work was paid for, and in fact, but the hours were similar in total. And I took it further and looked at it in an international perspective, because it became clear that Australia was quite unusual. We'll probably have time to talk about this as the session goes on, but the very high incidence of part-time work for women in Australia is not... We've got that alone a bit with the Netherlands is similar, but they have part-time work high for both men and women. The very great disparity, which is in the paid work hours, not so much now the participation rates, but the hours, was quite noticeable. Also noticeable, though, was how much care and other forms of domestic labour Australian men did, because there is this idea that somehow the Nordic countries are much better at making men involved in care, and the gender equity goals there that haven't been so much to the fore in this country. But Australian men actually matched in the early part of this century, matched Danish and Finnish men's care. And what was different about those countries in comparison to Australia was the low paid work hours and also the low care hours. So the total workloads of people in Western Europe were very much lower than the total workloads in Australia. And so what we're talking about in Australia is a very demanded of unit. People who are raising children, caring for others over the course of their working lifetimes are actually much more stressed. In Australia, they have a bit of this in common with the United States and also the UK. But it's, as Laura said, it's a structural issue, and it's a policy decision. There's a lot of things that can be tweaked to make it differently, make it different. There's obviously also important issues about what people want for themselves and how they would plan to do things. But what we now seem to be at a moment that we can address it is not having policies that force people into decisions that they would prefer not to make. So, again, we'll probably talk about it soon. But the disincentives for working, having both partners working part-time, these things can be addressed, and I'm very happy to be at a point in Australia where now it looks like we've got some very strong interest in making those changes, hearing how it can be altered, and moving on from what's been quite a stressful situation for carers and a very inequitable situation for women. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to now introduce Julia Fox, who's the National Assistant Secretary of the SDA, the Union for Workers in Retail, Fast Food and Warehousing. Julia has represented workers for over 2 decades and has some very interesting stories and information to tell.
Unfortunately, I think I've nearly hit 3 decades, but anyway, time flies when you're having fun. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Today I thought it would be helpful to give a bit of an overview of some recent research that our union did, the SDA, last year into the challenges that retail workers face when trying to manage their work and care. The research was actually born out of the ALP's Affordable Childcare Policy announcement. And for us, it was a question about the impact of this policy, because our suspicion was that in retail, not many people actually access formal childcare. So we just didn't have the sort of data and information, and we really wanted to test that. So that was kind of how this came about. But once we got into the question of childcare, we actually broadened out our research to look at all forms of care. So we actually asked our members what type of care arrangements they had, what type of care options they access and utilised in managing their care, how does this impact, how does the workplace impact their care arrangements and responsibilities. So we asked questions around their employment status, their rostering arrangements, their shift patterns, how they access additional hours, issues around insecurity and job security. And we asked about leave types, the effectiveness of things like paid parental leave, unpaid parental leave, personal leave, etc. And we asked about then the impact this is having on workers and how they manage their work and care. We also asked about the impact it's having on their families and their kids and those they love and care for. We partnered with the Social Policy Research Centre of the University of New South Wales to design the survey and do the report. And it's a fantastic report. It's very detailed, so I'm trying very hard to condense it here for you today, but it's a really very important piece of research. Before I take you through some of the key findings, I just wanted to put a little bit of context on the retail industry. Retail is actually a huge industry. It employs 10% of all working people in this country work in the retail industry. It's also, though, characterised by low pay, young people, a lot of young people. It's a feminised sector, has high levels of casual workforce, also has high levels of part-time insecure work. And by that, I mean this part-time employment model that we have in our industry, which is a system where part-timers are contracted or engaged and employed on very low base hour contracts. So they're guaranteed week in, week out, you'll get 8 hours a week, but we may offer you more at our whim. We might give you 20 hours this week, 10 the next, 30 the one after that. But all we can guarantee you is 8 hours, which makes it pretty hard to plan your life and care. So effectively, part-time work in our industry is treated like casual without the loading of a casual. So the research, we had 6,500 SDA members respond to our survey. It was open for 2 weeks, so we obviously hit a nerve about the challenges people face. Over half of those who responded said they had care responsibilities. And in fact, when we looked at the research, retail workers have really high levels of care responsibilities. So in fact, double the national average on pretty much every marker. For example, single parents in Australia make up about 14% of households. In retail, 25% of retail workers are single parents. Parent of a child with a disability, about 8% in the general community. In retail, it's 16%. We also see young workers passionate about young workers. We're a union that represents a lot of young workers, and they're a group who, again, often forgotten about when we talk about carers. And 13% of those under 25 years of age working in retail are carers, looking after a parent with an illness or a disability, and often also providing sibling care so their parents can work. The other thing about the care arrangements is it's multiple and complex care that our members are experiencing. It's often not just one form of care. They're managing children, they might also be caring for parents, etc. So it's multiple and it's complex. It's also unpaid, it's unsupported in the workplace, and it's highly gendered. So some of the key findings: flexibility in retail is an absolute myth. It doesn't exist. And if you do get it, it's based on luck. It's not based on good management practices. There is a huge underemployment problem in our industry, and you actually hear employers screaming for workers, but in our industry, people have these low contract hours. There's not many full-time jobs. 34% of our members said if they actually had more predictable, stable rosters, they'd be able to work more hours, and our members are crying out to work more hours. Members are also faced with insufficient hours, really short shifts. So 3-hour shift, 3 3/4 hour shift is common in our industry, spread over 5 days. We have high levels of job insecurity, and we have constant roster changes. 10% of working parents in retail have no regular workday, no fixed day. 60% say they don't work the same shifts each week. Now, when you think about that, how do I manage care? How do I book an appointment for my mum to see the heart specialist in 2 months' time when I don't know what day I'm going to be working? How do I book in for childcare? You can't, because childcare requires regular bookings. Employers don't offer regular hours. So it's a complex situation for retail workers. So what we see is actually more than half of our members who have parental responsibilities use and rely on informal care. They don't use the formal care sector at all. Half. Again, 10% of all working Australians is the size of this industry that I'm talking about. So over half rely on informal care, so they might use grandparents, neighbours, siblings to manage their care. The other finding is, from the research, is the really high levels, and I'm even shocked by how high the levels are, of punishment and repercussions that you face if you dare to try and change your roster or get a stable and fixed roster to manage your care responsibilities. So you're actively punished in the industry for having care responsibilities. And it's not just a few bad eggs in management. Every union official hears about the few bad eggs. It's not. It is systemic, it's widespread, it's cultural, it's really poor and lazy management practices, it's widespread, and it's systemic discrimination we are seeing across the board. So finally, I just want to touch on the impact that this work and care collision is having on people. Mental health. So 35% of the members say that the way I'm rostered to work impacts on my mental health. And I'll ask you to consider how many workplace policies on mental health and wellbeing actually go to the issue of things like rostering. Mental health and wellbeing is more than about apples and yoga. It's actually about the structures and systems that support people, and work and care is a huge part of our lives. So I challenge anyone who's got a mental health policy in the workplace, check that it actually talks about the systems and structures of work. The impact on children is significant. So over half of our members say that their kids miss out on activities like sport and art and swimming lessons because they don't have a fixed roster, right? So if my swimming lessons for my 4-year-old is every Thursday, I can't guarantee that I'll be there, so they miss out. And then we see the financial impact. It's like a pylon of compounding sort of pressures that are put on retail workers. Again, feminised, low-paid sector. And I give one example to demonstrate this, and that's working in our industry. Penalty rates apply Monday to Friday after 6 p.m, all day Saturday, all day Sunday. But if you take personal leave to care for someone, like you have a sick child, you just get paid the base rate of pay. You don't get your penalty rates on top. So I just hope that my child is sick between Monday to Friday, 9 till 5, and if they happen to be sick on Sunday, I'm going to lose pay, which then challenges the decisions I make and am able to make around my care choices. Because I don't really get to choose. I still have to feed the family. How do I do this? So that's a really good example, I think, of that financial punishment, again, that often women are experiencing because they provide care to others. So there's a lot more to this research, and I don't really have time to run through it all, but it's, I think, just highlighted the challenges that a lot of people face. Again, a face-to-face industry. It's not an industry our members can work from home. So rostering is a really important part of their lives. And I'm sure the panel's going to explore some of the questions we all have about how to actually address some of these and the policy levers we need. So I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Next, we have Dr. Fiona MacDonald. Fiona is the Policy Director with the Centre for Future Work at the Australia Institute. Fiona is recognised in Australia and internationally for her research on work and employment, focusing on gender equality and decent work. Fiona's recent research has explored working time and working from home, impacts of COVID on women's work and employment, and digital platform work in the social care sector. Welcome.
Thanks, Julia. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I hardly know where to start. There's so much I want to say, and everybody's the contributions from Lynn and Julia just make me keep thinking of more things. I want to talk a little bit. I want to think about most care work undertaken in Australia is unpaid care work. It's unpaid care work undertaken in families and communities, and it's enormous. But we are increasingly relying on paid care work, and we have, as you're probably aware, a really rapidly growing, very, very large and rapidly growing sector of paid care employment. The paid care sector has grown faster than any other sector of employment over the last 5 years. That specific growth has been due in part to the implementation of the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, but it is still predicted to be one of the fastest growing sectors over the next 15 years, I think. So it is a really big sector of employment. And so what work is like in this sector really matters. The way that we balance our work in care is increasingly through reliance on paid care workers. And I think we've got some really big problems. I think we're heading rapidly down a path where we're relying on a very large and largely invisible workforce in formalised arrangements where they are in employment that have very much has the kind of conditions that Julia's just pointed out in the retail industry, except they've actually got some additional problems because they don't even work in the same place often. Workers are moving around, so they face unpredictable, fragmented work. So in this growing workforce, much more care is now home-based. There are active policies in aged care for care to be in the home. We talk about, the Aged Care Royal Commission, so much focus was on residential aged care, and that's for good reason. There were some really, really, really big problems, but the growth and the shift and the location of much of our increasingly growing aged care sector will be home-based, and workers will be home-based. Our aged care sector, our NDIS that provides support to people with significant disability who need support with daily living, that's very much home and community-based too, and our early childhood education and care, which is our other major publicly funded care sector, is more institution-based. But again, there are elements of that are becoming home-based with the growth in home-based care there as well. So all of these systems have a lot of things in common. They are all what are so-called managed markets. They're publicly funded largely, in where we have the creation of so-called markets that are created, managed and funded by the government, and yet they're run on a market basis with competition between providers, and all three sectors now have private for-profit as well as not-for-profit and fewer public sector providers. In these sectors, though, the market structures and increasingly individualised consumer payments, so where rather than now the government's not a service provider, the government is a market manager, but the government doesn't pay block funding to service providers anymore in most cases. What it pays is individual subsidisation to a consumer, or a voucher where a consumer can purchase their care in a market. So these are the markets that workers are working in, and the pointy end, probably the really visible end of the problems for workers in these markets, for paid care workers, who themselves, like the retail workers, the majority of them are actually carers themselves. The pointy end of it that you can see are gig workers on digital platforms. You can see those workers, and you can see, I think, you see ads for them. I think around for people who don't see them. I know gig workers are not all young guys working on bicycles and just doing flexible, picking up an hour here or there, or using their car, as you would, again, you see ads. This is how people are supposedly using this work to just pick up some extra work. There's this reference to side hustle, whatever. Care workers, gig workers who are care workers are not those workers. Again, they're largely women. Some of them, again, may be holding multiple jobs and doing little bits of, a gig job on a platform may be extra to other work they're doing. But the bulk of the work in this sector is part-time. It's very casualised. It suffers from that unpredictability, fragmented work, high levels of underemployment. When people say, why can't we get enough care workers, why can't you just take all these underemployed workers and give them jobs? The work is structured increasingly by the fact that it's a hourly-based, a billable hours kind of regime. So service providers struggle to manage in where, you want to buy 3 hours care and I've got a worker who needs to be, if I want to employ a full-time worker, I've got to find other things for them to do. So what service providers do are sort of fragment the care and start employing people on short hours rather than investing in constructing longer periods of work. So I probably can't say too much more because it would take up too much time, but I think we really need to think about what's going on here. We not only have a gig platform-based growing gig workforce, we also have a growing workforce of invisible workers who are employed directly by individual consumers and households. Now, that works for a lot of people, but we're heading down a path that we've seen in many European countries where this is an invisibilised workforce that's excluded, they're beyond the reach of effective employment regulation. They might be engaged as independent contractors, but they might be employed in really informal arrangements. And is this what we're, is this what we want for both the quality of our care and the sustainability of our care system, for the workforce that needs to sustain people who can have a career in that workforce, who can have decent jobs over time. So I'll stop there because otherwise I'll just ramble on forever.
Well, I think there's clearly a lot to talk about, and we can probably do it for hours. But I thought we'd move on to just talking about the value of care, and in particular whether we think governments currently do value care, and what are some of the policy positions that might enable governments to do better. And Lynn, I thought you might have something to say about this.
Is that on? Yes. Our governments rhetorically value care, and I think that the difficulty is that it needs to be underwritten, socially underwritten. We need to have a social organisation of care that makes it doable for people in ways that, just as Fiona was saying, covers the gaps, the bits between the care. The idea that care is not something that you can do all day, every day. It structures people's lives and how they can plan to do it. If it's unpaid care and you've got young children, you obviously need to be there to be. You're not actively doing the care tasks every minute, but you're there as contingent labour should it arise. That is obviously going to affect your opportunities to be in the paid workforce, but that's just the way care is. It's episodic. And what we're doing now is assuming that people will just do the task bits, and the bits between will be on their own recognizance. It needs an overview, a willingness to say that this is a absolutely vital and valuable underpinning of our economy and our society. We can't reproduce ourselves without it. We can't, it's the way we live is completely dependent on care, and yet it's been taken for granted as unpaid work for so long. And now with the growth in the paid work force is reflective of the fact that the invisible army of care providers, when women were not able to work past marriage and that sort of thing, is very much unavailable now. And they're they're doing the care work and they're under the conditions described, and also often taking those jobs because it is slightly more flexible for their own caring responsibilities. And I think what's really important is for governments to join, just to see that they're sharers in this. It's not just individual decision makers who provide it, or families that provide it and work it out between themselves. There is an enormous social benefit that needs to be acknowledged and kind of paid back in time. There's a financial aspect to it, of course, but there's also the ability to make it work and be sustainable. I think we've really got a sustainability issue. The sustainable parenting, the fertility rates falling in countries where care responsibilities are just too high and too costly. When the costs fall on individuals, they make decisions that work for themselves. And so, it's an equity issue if you're a carer or you're not a carer. People who have care responsibilities have more demands on their time, more sacrifices they need to make about their financial security, and it can only be really addressed if it's seen as a general equity issue at a social level. And so I'll stop talking in a minute, but I think governments have a lot of contribution to make in regulation of work hours, predictable work hours. The predictability of work hours is a real problem, but also over the life course, the predictability of your care supports is a problem as well. In some countries, you've got so much paid parental leave. If it's a year, good, and you can share it between partners if you've got one. And then you've got a guaranteed, accessible and affordable care place. And then the child goes to school, often part-time at first, and then ideally you'd have flexible, secure, well-paid work that gave you time off if you needed it. But and then you would have your working lifetime, and you would retire with enough money to live on. That is not our situation in this country, and I think that there is a government responsibility to move towards it.
Thank you. Fiona and Julie, we've talked a little bit about casual and part-time employment. What are some of the structural changes that you think might be of benefit that we could be looking at implementing and doing?
I think just to go to the point of valuing care, I think the government's just made some changes. We were talking about to the Fair Work Commission with the establishment of a gender equity panel and bringing in panels that are experts in care, the care sector and community sector, and I think that is really important because we've seen that kind of lack of understanding of those sectors work against all the work that unions have done to try to get work value addressed, which they've had some success at, but it's been a real struggle. So those are structures that I think are really important. The other things that we have to tackle is structures and regulation that address all the workers that are falling outside the coverage of the Fair Work Act. So the gig economy workers, increasingly, that's what's happening. It's definitely happening in the care sector. If it's a problem, you don't want to pay your worker the minimum wage in the care sector, then you just take them outside into the independent contracting regime. And we have a growing workforce of so-called self-employed, small business people who are care workers, which is ludicrous. They're not protected. They don't have rights as other workers do. They don't have rights to bargain collectively. The minimum wage standard doesn't apply to them. They don't have any regulation of their working hours or other working conditions and standards, and they also carry an enormous, particularly in care, risk as the providers of care, who really, oddly, our structures our care systems demand that they be accountable for the quality of care and for safety of the people they're caring for, but there's no account, you know, they're not supported to do that. There's no oversight. So we need structures where people, it's not down to the individuals. We have oversight, and systemic responsibility has to be taken for workers' training, for their decent work and for their wages, rather than it being trickled down to whoever's at the bottom of the market to do that.
I was just going to add, in terms of casuals and part-timers, I sort of explained the situation we're in retail, which is quasi part-timer in name only, but you're treated like a casual, but you don't get paid like a casual. Casual employment in retail is gendered as well. More women are casually employed. More women are on the minimum award rates of pay. So we have an industry like that. So some of the key ones for me are about leave types, and casuals are excluded from paid leave types. Now, the first change we've had to that is the new family and domestic violence leave provisions. 10 days paid leave for all workers covered by the Fair Work Act, which is not all workers. But it is 10 days for full-time, part-time and casual and paid leave. That is really significant. It's also significant that it's paid at the base, not paid at the base rate of pay. It's actually paid at your rate of pay. So if I'm working on a Sunday, I will get the right rate of pay. So I think that's really important that we create leave types for casuals to, I think, disincentivise employers for constantly using this casual form of labour. In terms of part-time, there's lots of things that need to happen with part-time. There's a myth that kind of keeps perpetuating itself that women want part-time work. Sometimes they want a lot more hours than what they've got. We make assumptions about what women want and sort of gendered assessments of, well, they really should just work part-time, and we won't give them the hours that they need or request. And we do need predictable, stable rosters for many industries. So there's retail, there's aged care, there's so many industries that need predictable, secure, stable rostering that actually provides a living wage to people. The other important provision, I think, is the change to Section 65 of the Fair Work Act, which now means we have a right, instead of the previous right that we had in law, which was the right to ask a question, the right to request flexible work, that's all we had in law was the right to ask a question, is now an enforceable right, and you have a process that you can go through an arbitration at the end. So that will be, I hope, life-changing for lots and lots of people, particularly in our industry and many others, that they will have a chance to have rosters, stay in their employment and build a life for themselves.
Given our time, we might have one or two quick questions if anyone has one, and then we can finish up. So we have just got a couple of questions just over there on the right, if we could.
Hello, Ms. Anna again. I really thank you so much for the excellent research about retail. I work in a retail industry for 6 years. I'm grateful to my employer for allowing me to know many people through retail, but it's very painful. You talk all the pain that I experienced for the past 6 years. But I just want to ask the question, have you included the online training that we have to do at home? For example, in a big industry that I work, I have to participate every 2 months, 3 months, occupational health and safety training, 100 a page at home, hour and hour. Every 3 months, another 100 page of training, and I do it at home, and it's without getting paid. So have you including that? And the other question is about I love the union, but the union encouraged me to sign a contract as a permanent part-time. But I think that the idea the permanent part-time, I lose all the freedom. It's sometimes that I have to visit my parents-in-law on a Christmas. I have to work on that. And would you encourage that sometimes the casual, when at the moment we don't have enough people to work, would you encourage sometimes the casual would be better option, we get better pay, and then we don't have to force to work on our birthday or special occasion? Thank you. And last thing is the superannuation in the retail. Yeah. You know, the first month after I work, all my superannuation becomes zero because I did not know that the superannuation in the retail industry, they buy they use my super to spend $90 to spend on, the life insurance that I did not know. So after 1 year of working, and then they send me a letter, your superannuation now becomes zero, and then what happened?
Juliet, did you want to?
I'm just trying to remember all the questions. So the first one about working and doing things at home online has become a real feature of retail employers who, you know, some of the ones we deal with are very large, and so in trying to train 100,000 workers, they decide that we'll run a little online module and we'll do it during work time, and people are doing it at home. So we have claims in our bargaining around enterprise agreements to all work is paid work, full stop. And I would think that after Woolworths, which is up to $600 million, $700 million of back pay, we've got Coles, you know, they're not paying people for the work they have been performing. I'm pretty sure that's got to change. Your second one about part-time, and this is where part-time, and so as a union we've had to defend many attacks on part-time in our award. So employers really want part-time to look like casual, and that's kind of what's happened with low part-time hours. As a minimum in our industry, in our award, so the minimum entitlements in this country in the retail industry award is you are guaranteed 3 hours a week part-time. I don't know anyone who wants a part-time job for 3 hours a week, but so that's the base that we're having to bargain off, right? So we try and get 10 or 12 or 15 or 20, right? But permanency is helpful because casuals are the first to be let go when there's the peaks, you know, the troughs of retail. And so we would encourage permanent work, but it's got to be meaningful work and work that's, you know, able to be flexible when you need time to see parents or adjust like that. So that's where those changes need to be made to allow you to live a life and have a life for yourself.
Thanks, Juliet. We're just going to take 2 more questions, if that's all right. This gentleman over there in the grey. Yep.
Yes, Robert Lindsay is my name. My question is mostly to Julia. I have a daughter who used to work in the retail industry and a son who used to work in the hospitality industry and suffers much of the same sort of issues around limited hours and an irregular roster, which meant that neither of them could take another job to boost their hours because they couldn't make the rosters fit together. But unfortunately, neither of them at that time were also able to afford to join the union, which reduces the union's capacity to address the issues for those workers. My question is, what steps would you like to see the Albanese government take to address that problem?
Interesting point, your first point about sort of multiple jobs. That's the other boom that's happening in Australia. We've got 14% of people working multiple jobs. And the question comes, because some employers in our industry are quite unhappy with that, because you say, well, I can't work Friday because I'm working at McDonald's on Friday, or Woolworths want you on Friday. So that's the challenge, and you're more likely in our industry to be working in another job in our industry or in hospitality. So again, same sorts of patterns of hours where they want the workers. So that's one challenge. In terms of union fees, we actually charge, I would say, pretty low fees, but casuals are a real problem. I've got a 17-year-old who's arguing with me at the moment about union fees and the cost. And so I'm taking him through many sessions on cost-benefit analysis. But it is really important that that workers understand the benefit of unions, understand what trade unions do, but trade unions need the right to build strong enterprise agreements, proper industrial awards and minimums, and we need union members to do that. So it's this balance of trying to make sure we can deliver for our members that we have, making sure that we bring new members in, but fees are always a challenge, absolutely.
Excellent. I have one more question. It's with this lady at the front here.
Very enlightening. My work has been in the aged care field, and certainly the lack of workers, 30% want more hours. Providers, have a look on your own doorstep. But my question is, given that in the human services sector as opposed to retail, we have a lot of supposed not-for-profit providers, they just make surpluses. But is there any difference, do you think, in negotiating with them And do you think they will change their tune with the change of government? Because many of them pursued the sort of casualisation, gig economy. Most of the casuals are actually within the sector. They're employed by XYZ Care rather than being gig workers. But I just wondered, are there any differences in the past, or do you expect any differences between private and not-for-profit providers in the sector? Or would you hope for them, and how could they be pursued?
I would optimistically think that there will be. I know in the early childhood education and care sector, there's clear evidence that the for-profits pay more to their executive staff, pay their care staff less, and score less on quality measures. And, you know, and they're implicated in the fact that we have childcare deserts because you don't set up where people aren't affluent and they can't pay you higher fees. So the Labor government in Victoria has just put in place a strategy where they're supporting free kindergarten for children in the state, and they're only paying the public sector and the community sector and the not-for-profit providers. So this partial answer to your question, whether the not-for-profits who are making surpluses, whether the not-for-profits will behave differently, where they're not now. I think what has happened, and I'm most familiar with the NDIS sector in this regard, there are channels of communication are open. The previous government supported and facilitated gig platforms in that sector. They gave them hundreds of thousands of dollars during COVID to provide surge workforces. And the not-for-profit providers who are employing their workers with reasonable conditions in stable, ongoing work kept saying, we can't afford to do this. And the government kept saying, you're not efficient providers because you're not doing it as cheaply as the gig platforms who were not employing them, just engaging them as contractors. So I think there's an awareness of this problem, and there are reviews and conversations that are happening around that. So I'm optimistic.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think there's a lot of discussions to be had, and hopefully this is a bit of food for thought. And thanks again to Lynn, Julia and Fiona for participating today.